I'm aware that it's late and we're hungry. I'm hungry. But I want to just share a few words. On Monday was the 80th anniversary of liberation of Auschwitz, which was a big deal day in some parts of the world, including England, where I'm from. International Holocaust Awareness Day is marked on January 27th. We tend as a community to mark more Yom HaShoah. But along with the Sturzes and others, on Tuesday I went to the Denver Jewish Film Festival and the Denver JCC and saw Lisa Efres produced this amazing film called For the Living, which is based around the story of the incredible bike ride that I actually did a few years ago from Auschwitz to Krakow, which is called Ride for the Living, which is trying to show that Auschwitz happened, but there is a regeneration of Jewish life in Poland, and it coincides with the Jewish Cultural Festival. And it centers in a way around the story of Marcel Zelinsky, who I got to meet and ride with, who is now in his very late 80s, a Holocaust survivor, who was a 10-year-old boy, was liberated from Auschwitz and didn't know what to do, and with some other kids walked 60 miles from Auschwitz Birkenau to his home in Krakow, trying to find his home, and he didn't have a home anymore, and none of his family survived, although later on he was reunited with his mother, who did survive. And then he grew up in Canada, and years and years later a very avid cyclist called Robert met Marcel, and together they conceived of this idea of doing a bike ride to ride the same 60 miles that he as a 10-year-old boy had walked. And the film, For the Living, although it's based around that story, Marcel's story, and the story of riders from all over the world who ride their 60 miles from Auschwitz every year to the JCC in Krakow. And actually on Monday, some of you may have seen, on the actual day of the liberation of Auschwitz, King Charles III was there in Krakow, and his only public appearance that day was actually speaking at the JCC in Krakow, and he talked about the power of the regeneration of Jewish life there. The message of the film, which doesn't just talk about the Holocaust, it talks about many different genocides that we've seen throughout human history in a very powerful and provocative way. But really what the film talks about is, on the one hand, dehumanization, which all of us are capable of doing. We're all capable of dehumanizing people who have other perspectives, other beliefs, other colors, other sexual expressions, all of it. On one hand, dehumanization, on the other hand, the power of empathy and the capacity that we must all have to have empathy for one another, which isn't always easy, as we sort of already discussed in a different way when we're talking about having open, soft hearts. But one of the scenes in the film that just is so disturbing is the scene that shows just how ignorant most people are of history. And there's a scene where a student is interviewing other students about the Civil War, and almost nobody that was interviewed knew what the Civil War was fought about, who the two sides were. And then if we take that to talk about the Holocaust, there are so many statistics about just the absolute ignorance of what people know and don't know about the Holocaust. An astounding number of teenagers have never heard of Adolf Hitler, have never heard of Auschwitz, do not know what the Holocaust was, right? And I say all that because it is so important. It is so important to know who we are. Not just about learning Holocaust history, learning the history of the Middle East, learning the history of Israel, learning, if you want to take a strong position, whatever your strong position is, it has to come from a place of knowledge. I heard a very disturbing story about someone who's newer to the community, who's a professor of choral music at CU, who was putting on a concert, and one of the pieces in the concert was an Israeli piece in Hebrew that had been written by somebody who died 30 years ago, who left Israel in the 1950s, and 3 students wrote a letter to their professor saying, "We refuse to sing a song in the language of genocide." Wow. And this comes from unbelievable ignorance. Like English isn't a language of genocide. You know, there was also happened to be a Russian. There was a Russian song. They didn't care about that. Is Russian a language of genocide? So the just unbelievable ignorance that people have about history and the unwillingness to understand history because they want to take a strong position on one side or the other. How do I relate this to this parsha? Because this parsha, just the part that we read, the last third of the parsha, has in it references to many different mitzvot and rituals and traditions, right? Mezuzah is referenced, right? Tefillin is referenced. Pidyon haben, redemption of the firstborn, is referenced. Of course, the Pesach, the ritual and the sacrificial ritual and the celebration of Pesach is mentioned and referred to in that part. But probably the most important one is tell the story. Tell the story 3 times while the Israelites are getting ready to leave. While they're getting ready to leave, Moshe seems to say to them, you know what, in the future, your children are going to ask you what this is all about, and this is what you have to tell them. The power of learning our story, of knowing our story, of telling our story, of being able to answer questions, or at least to engage the questions. It is so important. It is so important. And the way Rabbi Jonathan Sachs phrases it is so powerful. He says, why was this the most important thing that Moshe could do in this moment of redemption? This, telling them, like, you know, on that day your child's going to say, you know, you're going to tell your child it's because of what God did for us at this time, right? And then in the future your child's going to ask, you know, what is this? And all of these questions, of course, that Moshe predicts are the questions that are put into the mouths of the 4 children in the Seder, right? And so Rabbi Sachs says, why is this the most important thing? Because freedom is the work of a nation. Nations need identity. Identity needs memory. And memory is encoded in the stories that we tell. Without narrative, there is no memory. And without memory, we have no identity. The most powerful link between the generations is the tale of those who came before us. A tale that becomes ours and that we hand on as a sacred heritage to those who will come after us. We are the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, and identity begins in the story parents tell their children. Identity begins in the story that parents tell their children. Identity begins in the story educators tell their students. Identity is so important. Identity is often used as a weapon. Identity politics can be weaponizing, but identity, knowing who we are, knowing what our stories are, so important. And I will say that as a community we value, and having hired Rob Jacob to lead our educational initiatives, we so value. People are, of course, have to form their own opinions and their own values and their own ideas, but they do it through a position of learning our stories, learning our narratives, learning our texts, learning our rituals, learning our mitzvot, learning our traditions. That's who they become, who they need to be in this world, and have the ability to ask questions, the ability to stand up for their version of what is just and true. When people stand up for a value that they perceive that they've seen on a 2-minute TikTok video, that is not about continuing a narrative of identity and tradition. And it's very dangerous the way in which people have a perceived identity based on a lack of information. That's something that we have to fight against. We have to educate as parents, as grandparents, as educators. We have to give the capacity for story. There's an African, a Nigerian writer who I really admire, Ben Okri, and he writes a lot about sacred storytelling. And he says the greatest stories are those that resonate our beginnings and intuit our endings, our mysterious origins and our numinous destinies, and dissolve them both into one. He could almost be describing what's happening in that part of Exodus, right? This idea that in the present moment, as the Israelites are getting ready to leave Egypt, Moshe is predicting how the future and the past and the present are going to meet each other. And they're going to meet each other through the power of sacred storytelling and ritualized storytelling. and having those narratives be part of what we do and what we share and how we act in the world. Twice in the Haggadah, the term b'chol dor vador is used, which means in every generation. The first time is in Vahi she'amda. Vahi she'amda lavotenu, right? They have, that God's promise is somehow going to be filled. Sheb'chol dor vador amad aleinu lechalotenu. In every generation, enemies have arisen who have sought to destroy us. And somehow the narrative continues, but Kadosh Baruch Hu is going to save us. It's connected, that passage is connected to the second cup of wine, which is about God's promise to save us from our oppression, right? And this idea that we somehow, on the one hand, we recognize that in every generation there's going to be enemies who seek to destroy us, and of course we know so well the sinister shadows of anti-Semitism from the left, from the right, from the center, from everywhere. We're being faced with very grim forces of anti-Semitism, and it shows up in all kinds of different ways, but somehow that's connecting us not just in its moment in history, but to the whole past. And then of course the next part, closer towards the meal, he says, as when are we going to eat? When are we going to eat? But b'chol dor chayav adam lirot et atzmo ke'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim, says the Haggadah. In every generation, a person is obligated to see themselves as if they came out of Egypt. And this idea of continuity, of memory, of narrative, of telling the story, it's so powerful, and it goes across the generations. And I think that the most important spiritual weapon that we can have, whatever we're perceiving this world to be right now, whatever our views are on Israel, Palestine, whatever our views are of what's going on in this country and elsewhere in the world, and how we connect the stories of our tradition to the stories of our world right now. The most important thing we can do is educate ourselves and educate our children so that we can continue to tell the stories as Moshe implores the Israelites to continue to tell the stories in the future. Shabbat Shalom.